Percepcija naše okoline limitirana je fiziološkim ograničenjima naših osjetila. No, u sveukupnom ljudskom iskustvu ne nedostaje takozvanih transpersonalnih iskustava, kod kojih svijest transcendira prostor i vrijeme. Spektar transpersonalnih iskustava izrazito je bogat i raznovrstan. Upravo ti fenomeni su prije više od 50 godina privukli pažnju psihijatra Stanislava Grofa, kojeg danas mnogi smatraju najvećim svjetskim istraživačem svjesnosti. Dok se svi pravci psihologije i psihijatrije na ovaj ili onaj način bave biografskim iskustvima, najveći doprinos Stanislava Grofa razumijevanju ljudske prirode i osobnosti jest da ako želimo doista shvatiti prirodu ljudskosti i osobnosti, moramo kartografiju psihe proširiti na takozvana perinatalna iskustva, to jest traumu rođenja i transpersonalna iskustva. Zato je pola stoljeća kliničkih i istraživačkih aktivnosti Stanislav Grof podredio istraživanju takozvanih izmijenjenih ili holotropskih stanja svijesti, te njihovih terapeutskih i transformacijskih potencijala. Po putu je otkrio i to da je svijest posredovana mozgom, ali ne i njegov produkt. Osim što je utemeljitelj transpersonalne psihologije, sa suprugom Kristinom stvorio i tehniku holotropskog disanja, kod koje se jednostavnim elementima kao što su glazba, disanje i rad na tijelu stvaraju holotropska stanja svijesti. Bilo je samo pitanje vremena kada ćemo sa Stanislavom Grofom popričati i ovdje, na rubu znanosti. Dobro večer. Dr. Stanislav Grof je psihijatar, jedan od začetnika transpersonalne psihologije, također je autor tehnike poznate kao holotropski rad disanjem. Svakako pionir u istraživanju svijesti i svjesnosti. A to je sve ono što ćemo dotaknuti večeras. Dobro večer. Što je uopće svjesnost? Može li se taj pojam objasniti na bilo koji način? Znamo da ima više veze sa glavom nego s nogama, ali niti to baš nije sigurno. Što uopće jest svijest prema današnjim spoznajama i vašim spoznajama?
I would like just to say that I will understand if what I'm talking about will be challenging for many people, especially with academic education, because it took me a long time to believe my own observations, and they're really challenging much of what we are teaching. So there's a general assumption that consciousness is somehow produced in the brain, and very few people understand that we have absolutely no proof that consciousness is coming from the brain. There are correlations between what's happening anatomically, physiologically, biochemically in the brain and states of consciousness. But that's really not a proof that consciousness is coming from the brain. So I'm not questioning the observations of the correlations, but I'm seriously questioning the conclusions that were made. We have a similar situation in the television, where the sound and the picture is correlated with what's happening, with the circuits and the transistors and the specific elements in the TV set. But that's not a proof that the program is generated in the box. It still leaves the possibility that somehow the television set mediates the program, but the program is coming from somewhere else. So after all these years, I have now studied states of consciousness, particularly non-ordinary states of consciousness, over half a century, about 56 years. And I believe now that consciousness is a cosmic phenomenon, very much like Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, talk about anima mundi, the cosmic consciousness, and our individual psyche partakes somehow in this cosmic consciousness, and the boundary between us and the larger consciousness are really not absolute, they are negotiable. In these certain non-ordinary states we can transcend it and we can experience much more than what we have stored in our brain.
Koji su to primjeri koji ukazuju da svjesnost u određenim uvjetima može nekako operirati i imati funkcije koje nadilaze kapacitet mozga?
Well, one example, major example that many people will know is what happens in people in near-death situations. Let's say somebody's operated and they have cardiac arrest. There are instances where you're not just cardiac death, but your electroencephalogram is flat, you're brain dead. And while they are resuscitating you, consciousness gets out of the body and maybe observes it from the ceiling, can go down and check what's happening, on the dials of the different gadgets. The consciousness can decide to go for a little trip into some other parts of the building. They can go through the ceiling and experience what's happening around. You can experience something that's happening hundreds of miles away. And if you have somebody who is open-minded and interested, you find out those are accurate experiences that can be what's called consensually validated. People can go and find out that those things really happened. And we have now studies showing that people organically blind, for organic reasons, since the time of birth, when they have the near-death experience and their consciousness comes out of the body, they can see. And the term for it is, what really is interesting is veridical out-of-body experiences, that they not only can see, but people who have the gift of vision can actually confirm that what they see is really there.
Što su to uopće izmijenjena stanja svijesti? Kako ih se postiže? Koja bi im bila praktična primjena?
I really strongly dislike the term altered, because it suggests that somehow there's an accurate, correct way of experiencing ourselves and the world. And that's kind of distorted. I always think about veterinary medicine in the American slang and veterinary jargon. Altered is used for castration. Did you have your cat altered? Did you have your pet altered?
A kad pričamo o izmijenjenim stanjima svijesti, upravo je suprotno.
Yes, and I have too much respect for these states to call them altered, and so my interest has been over the years in a certain large subcategory of these states. Better term is non-ordinary states that are healing, transformative, I believe evolutionary, and they also have what we call heuristic value. In other words, experiencing them or working with them, we can get new, absolutely revolutionary information about the psyche, about consciousness, and even the nature of reality. And I was astounded that psychiatry, psychology does not have specific term for that. It's all altered states of consciousness and basically pathology. And so when I saw we didn't have the term, I coined the term myself. I call them holotropic, which means holos means whole, and trepein means moving in the direction of something. So there's the states that help us move toward wholeness. And if you mention this to somebody from the industrial civilization, they would say, "What do you mean, wholeness? Aren't we already whole the way we experience ourselves?" And I would say, no, we are experiencing only a small fraction of our real potential. And in Hinduism, they tell you we are not nama rupa, we are not name and shape, we are not body ego. Our true identity is with the core, innerst the core of cosmic creative energy. They call it Atman. They give you procedures if you follow them, the yogas and so on. You can experience your full identity with that core. And when you have the experience of identification with Atman, you realize that this is identical with the cosmic creative energy. So Atman is Brahman. And so that's our true identity. And consciousness for me is a cosmic phenomenon.
Tu se nalazimo, kao i uvijek, pomalo izgubljeni u prijevodu. Kako vi gledate na ovaj jedan paradigmu koja prevladava na zapadu barem 200 godina, ako ne i više od Descartesa, koja svodi svijet na materiju, a sve fenomene koje vidimo smatra proizvodom materije? Očigledno je da to nije vaš pogled na stvari. Međutim, koje su tu bitne razlike zbog čega su takva dva pogleda na stvari na neki način čak i nespojivi?
Even in the year 1962, Thomas Kuhn was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, wrote a fantastic book which is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He studied the history of Western science for 15 years, and he found out that this is not a kind of a linear development where you have sort of more and more observations, more accurate hypotheses, but that it really breaks into cycles. And there's a period which is dominated by what he called paradigms, so some basic metaphysical assumptions and how do you do research, how you evaluate the research and so on. And until some kind of observations come that are challenging it. And usually it's seen as bad science and the persons are crazy who are coming with the alternatives. But if you have confirmation of these observations, then there's a crisis. And he calls that abnormal science. And then wilder and wilder sort of explanations are coming until one of these interpretations becomes the new paradigm until some more observations come. So, for example, it took 100 years to from the shift from the geocentric to the heliocentric system. And the opposition was coming not just from the church, but it's coming from the universities. Another example was they believed that in chemistry that all compounds are combinations of some material substances and this royal substance called phlogiston. And when Lavoisier and Dalton came with the idea there might be atoms, again, there was a tremendous turmoil about it until today, we laugh about phlogiston. And of course, the first 3 decades of this 20th century, there was a paradigm change like this in physics from Newton's physics, first to theories of relativity and then to quantum theory that even Einstein himself, who inspired it, could not accept. So I believe we are now between paradigms. We have too many anomalous observations. You see something that doesn't fit. We have the term anomalous experiences, and the real definition of anomalous experiences is what's left over if you apply a bad theory. So for too many anomalous experiences, you need a new theory. And we have now enormous number of observations from psychedelic therapy, from anthropological fieldwork, from parapsychology, from experiential psychotherapy, from thanatology. You see these near-death experiences showing that we really need a major paradigm change. And in my opinion, if you study these holotropic states, it would cause revolution in psychology and psychiatry that would be comparable to what happened in physics in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And in some sense, it would be actually a logical complement, the understanding of the psyche, of what already happened in the world of matter. For example, my work was initially accepted much better by quantum relativistic physicists than by psychologists or psychiatrists who still believe in what Fritjof Capra called the Cartesian Newtonian paradigm, which is a 17th century philosophy. And physics are, since the discovery of radioactivity and X-rays, they are in a whole other world.
Kada pričamo o teoriji tradicionalne znanosti, povijest svemira i povijest razvoja materije, sada smo vidjeli kako ova područje holotropskih stanja svijesti izgleda iz te perspektive i rekli ste, evo, preko 50 godina istraživanja tih holotropskih stanja svijesti pokazalo je postojanje dimenzija koje su daleko izvan dosega naših osjetila u svakodnevnoj stvarnosti i tu smo već u području koje se obično zove područjem duhovnosti. Na duhovnost su šapu stavile religije po svijetu i uzele monopol na time. Koja je razlika u stvari između duhovnosti i religija kada pričamo o iskustvima kao poput ovih holotropskih?
Well, first of all, the materialistic science denies any spiritual dimension. I mean, which is sort of monistic materialism. And if you are spiritual or you believe in something spiritual, you simply have not studied your science. You don't know what materialistic science discovered about the universe. So it's superstition, it's magical thinking, primary process. And if people have spiritual experiences, they get a diagnosis. We don't have in psychiatry a category which is a spiritual experience, mystical experience. This is all pathology. Now, in terms of religion was inspired by what we now call transpersonal experiences, direct experiences of the spiritual dimensions that are normally not available to our experience. But then when religions become organized, you see, many of them lose the connection to the spiritual source. And then it's about hierarchies and a lot of secular things, politics and so on. Or they get involved in some issues like, if you can use contraception or abortion, which have very little to do eventually with spirituality. So what is confirmed in holotropic states is the spiritual dimension of the psyche, spiritual dimension of the universal design, but you don't confirm the dogmas of the major religions. Spirituality is something between you and the cosmos. It's a specific kind of connection. And the mystics have kind of a hotline to God. They can directly experience the divine, and they experience it particularly inside. They experience their own divinity. And the message from organized religions is God is out there, and you have to go through the hierarchy, and frequently you have to pay for it. You can be very spiritual and not have any religion, and you can be religious, and it's very difficult to find spirituality in it. In the United States, we have these televangelists, and they would sort of have a program, and they would say, I see somebody suffering, they're in darkness, and if you send your little check, I will personally intervene with Jesus, and then they are caught somewhere with a prostitute in a motel. So you can have a religion without spirituality, but you can also be very spiritual without necessarily claiming, connection with any specific religion.
Duhovnost bi dakle bila bazirana upravo na direktnom i osobnom iskustvu tih dimenzija koje se nalaze izvan raspona naših osjetila. Kao jedan od utemeljitelja transpersonalne psihologije, koja danas više nije ni nepoznata, i osoba koja je zapravo sudjelovala u davanju imena toj grani, kako biste definirali transpersonalnu psihologiju?
Well, transpersonal psychology is psychology that studies the whole spectrum of human experience, includes what I call the holotropic states. In other words, what happens to people in spiritual practice, in deep meditation, what happens to shamans as part of the initiatory crisis, the states that they induce in their clients when they work with them, the kind of states that in native cultures they experience in what's called rites of passage, powerful rituals enacted at the time of some important biological or social transitions, the kind of states that were happening to initiates in the ancient mysteries. And then, what happens to yogis, what happens to Buddhists in meditation, Taoists, Kabbalists, Christian mystics, Jesus' prayer, hesychasm. What happens sort of in the mystical branches of religions. The real spirituality is found in mystics of the religions. So when people have holotropic experiences, they identify with the mystics, Hildegard von Bingen or Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, and so on. It doesn't really have much to do with the dogmas in Christianity. If it's an Islamic experience, they would identify with the Sufis who do things, whether it's breathing, dancing, or the whirling dervishes, that they have direct experience of what Jung would call the numinous dimension, the sacred dimension of reality. So you find this in the mystical branches.
Može li se reći da je neki prapočetak ili barem začetak transpersonalne psihologije postavio još Jung, koji se bavio nekim sličnim stvarima poput skidanja uzročno-posljedičnih veza tijekom sinkroniciteta, također je surađivao s fizičarima kao što je Wolfgang Pauli?
Well, transpersonal psychology has its heroes, as any other sort of development in science. So we certainly honor Jung, certainly honor Roberto Assagioli, who was a pioneer of psychosynthesis, which is a very spiritual system in psychology. Then William James, you see, those are people who practiced sort of, transpersonal methods, or they had transpersonal ideas. I think Jung once actually used the term überpersönlich, transpersonal. And, Jung's the whole history is kind of interesting. My wife Christina and I coined the term spiritual emergency, crisis of spiritual opening, that certain states, holotropic states, which happen spontaneously, that would be today diagnosed and treated as psychosis, can be understood very differently. When you support them, when you guide people, they can get through it, and it's actually a healing movement, transformative movement in the psyche, and Jung is the best example. I mean, Jung had periods of time that they had really, really challenging experiences where he questioned his sanity, and then he sort of turned it around and made a amazing psychology out of it. So Jung is our hero in the transpersonal circles.
On se bavio transpersonalnom psihologijom dok ona još nije imala svoje ime. Vratit ćemo se mi opet u razgovor. Inače, kratak opis područja rada Stanislava Grofa, također i nešto subjektivnog iskustva vezanog uz holotropsko disanje pronašli smo i u blizini, jer se rad holotropskim disanjem već koju godinu može naći i u Hrvatskoj.
Spoznao o transcendenciji svjesnosti izvan opipljivih granica osobnosti otvorila je nove pravce psihologije. Taj doprinos možemo zahvaliti 82-godišnjem psihijatru i istaknutom suvremenom misliocu Stanislavu Grofu. Njegova istraživačka znatiželja potaknuta je sredinom 1950-ih kada je radio na odsjeku psihijatrije na Medicinskom fakultetu u Pragu. Znanstvenici iz švicarskog laboratorija Sandoz slali su uzorke LSD-a laboratorijima diljem svijeta kako bi se istražili potencijali tog psihodelika, te kako bi njegovom uporabom u sigurnim uvjetima psihijatri bolje spoznali svijet svojih pacijenata.
Induciran visokom dozom LSD-a zapravo doživio ono što čitamo često u literaturi kao bijelu svjetlost, osjećaj jednote. I to ga je zapravo toliko zaprepastilo da je cjeloživotno odlučio se posvetiti istraživanjima svjesnosti i istraživanjima tih izmijenjenih stanja svijesti koje on naziva holotropskima. Od grčkih riječi holos je trepein, cjeloviti, kretati se ka. Dakle, kretati se prema cjelovitosti, on tako zove ta izmijenjena stanja svijesti. Kako je prešao u Ameriku, tamo je na velikim institutima, dakle u Marylandu, na Johnu Hopkinsu, u Esselenu, kao vodeći istraživač tima, dakle godinama proučavao psihijatrijsku primjenu zapravo LSD-a u terapiji i radu sa psihijatrijskim pacijentima.
Poznati američki psiholog Abraham Maslow utemeljio je humanističku psihologiju tijekom 1960-ih. Definirao je poznatu teoriju hijerarhije potreba.
Naime, Maslow je na svom humanističkom modelu ustanovio jedan nedostatak, a to je da kroz taj model ne može potkriti tu šestu, možda najvišu potrebu na onoj njegovoj slavnoj ljestvici potreba. On je pred kraj života dodao tu šestu, to je potreba za transcendencijom, da svako samoostvareno ljudsko biće ima potrebu za spoznajom svoje prave prirode, svog jastva, što neminovno znači transcendenciju onoga što nazivamo egoičnim selfom. I tu se ustanovila ta potreba zapravo za novim širim okvirom u psihologiji. Grof joj je dao ime, dakle, Maslow je htio da se zove transhumanistička, a onda je zapravo Grofova riječ je bila transpersonalna.
Stanislav Grof tako je utemeljio transpersonalnu psihologiju, disciplinu koja objedinjuje koncepte tradicionalne psihologije s transcendentnim iskustvima. Istražuje se širi kontekst psihe koji nije ograničen na iskustva nakon rođenja.
Ali ono što je fascinantno, dakle, što je zapravo možda njegov najveći doprinos čovječanstvu uopće, je upravo ta proširena kartografija psihe, gdje on uspio mapirati u različitim fazama poroda što se, dakle, događa sa našom psihom, sa imprintima koje dobivamo u tom trenutku. Mislim, pa kad pogledate, to je borba na život i smrt, jel? Znači, to mora biti vrlo traumatičan proces. Tako da od tuda i dolazi pojam birth trauma ili, dakle, trauma rođenja koju on izrazito proučavao.
Godine 1968. posjedovanje LSD-a postalo je ilegalno u Sjedinjenim državama, a nekoliko godina poslije i u mnogim zemljama diljem svijeta. Grof je počeo istraživati alternativne tehnike koje čovjeka mogu dovesti u stanje izmijenjene svijesti s terapeutskim učinkom.
On je obilazio svijet i promatrao i kako nativne kulture, znači on dolaze u ta holotropska stanja, jer holotropska stanja su nam poznata već 10.000 godina, dakle od prvih šamanizama pa nadalje, dakle postoje ti određeni oblici kad se mijenja svijest i kad se kroz tu izmijenjenu svijest vraća šaman, liječnik plemenski liječi cijelo pleme fizički, emocionalno i tako dalje. Tu je upotreba daha, tu je upotreba zvukova, ritmičkih kretanja, ritmičkih bubnjeva. Dakle, ima raznih načina kroz koje smo od pamti vijeka se dovodili u takva stanja.
Tako je otkrivena metoda holotropskog disanja gdje ispitanici u sigurnom okružju slušajući ritam glazbe rabe posebne tehnike disanja.
Možemo doći u to isto stanje u koje se dovedemo i uz pomoć psihodelika, što je ujedno zapravo i dokaz da i iskustva koja ljudi imaju pod utjecajem psihodelika zapravo nisu halucinacije, nego da su psihodelici samo induktori za pristup u šira područja svjesnosti. Jedna sesija holotropskog disanja, za nju se trebate odvojiti par sati, jer sama sesija disanja traje 3 sata, ali sam proces, dakle, priprema, sesija i integracija su 3 jednako važna dijela procesa ako ih koristimo, znači, u nekakve terapijske ili samo istraživačke svrhe. Dakle, onda nam je važno da imamo početak, da imamo sesiju kao takvu i da imamo integraciju, to jest razumijevanje tih iskustava, tako da je potrebno nekoliko sati. Ja sam zbog određenih procesa, u mom procesu poroda, to sam ustanovila kroz godine terapije, i kasnije imala uvijek priličan strah od gušenja. Nisam mogla biti u velikim masama, kroz nekoliko mjeseci zapravo rada kroz holotropsko disanje. Dakle, ja sam prolazila ponovo kroz ta iskustva poroda, kao i neka druga transpersonalna iskustva gdje se ponavljao taj motiv gušenja, disanja, prerezanog grkljana ili uglavnom nečeg što bi onemogućavalo disanje. I onda prošle godine, baš, mogu reći, prošle godine je na trgu se događalo neko ogromno okupljanje, bilo je strašno puno ljudi. U nekom trenutku mi je samo postalo jasno, gle, koliko ljudi oko mene, ja bi se nekad prije, recimo u takvoj situaciji, ja bi dobila možda nekakvu paniku, ali ne bi se ni dovela u takvu situaciju jer me to užasavalo. Dakle, gdje stvarno sam primijetila, dakle, vidjela sam jasno i evidentno da nemam nikakav strah, znači da ništa iznutra u meni se nije pomaklo. Dakle, da je prirodno u potpunosti otišao i taj uzrok od kojeg je bio taj strah, pa posljedično i sam taj strah od masa i od gušenja.
Abraham Maslow izjavio je jednom prigodom kako nitko drugi u 20. stoljeću nije tako snažno utjecao na razvoj teorije osobnosti kao što je to učinio Stanislav Grof.
Gomila radova znanstvenih, brdo knjiga prevedenih na mnoge svjetske jezike i zapravo u svakom slučaju jedan veliki um koji do svojih struktura, to jest do svojih kartografija i do svojih uvida zapravo ne dolazi kroz proučavanje literature, nego kroz empiriju, kroz praksu. On je u 50 godina napravio preko 30.000 kliničkih sesija, znači na osnovu čijih rezultata on zapravo je razvio svoje uvide i dakle proširio neki naš način razmišljanja i kako gledamo na psihu, svjesnost i prirodu svijeta u kojem živimo.
Sad smo odmotali malo priču vašeg života, ugurali smo u nekoliko minuta, ali prije nego što nastavimo, bilo bi možda dobro vratiti se 50 godina unatrag. Sjećate li se svog prvog susreta sa holotropskim stanjima svijesti? Kad je to bilo? Mislim da ste još bili u Pragu u to vrijeme. Kako je to bio vaš prvi susret i kakav ima uopće utjecaj na vas i pomoću koje tvari se to događalo?
Okay, let me just say about holotropic breathwork. I developed it with my wife, Christina. It's always credited just to me, and I would like to sort of mention that this was a joint effort.
Slažem se, nije pošteno nekoga zaboraviti.
Okay, so my first encounter was with, when I, as a new psychiatrist, volunteered for an LSD session. Sandoz from Switzerland, this is a pharmaceutical company, where LSD was discovered by Dr. Albert Hofmann, practically by accident where he intoxicated himself with the substance that he was synthesizing. And then a pilot study was made by Dr. Stoll in Zurich, and a paper was published which became a scientific sensation. And Sandoz was then sending samples to different research institutes, universities, even individual therapists, and was saying, we feel that this could be of interest to psychiatrists, psychologists. Would you like to work with it and give us some feedback? And they gave 2 tips. They say maybe this could be used as a model psychosis, because there seems to be some similarity between LSD experiences and what happens to certain kinds of psychiatric patients. And it's always great to have a model. You can give it to a group of people and study all kinds of things before, during, and after, and you get insights as to what's happening in the organism when these psychological changes happen. And then there was another tip they gave, which became my destiny or karma, whatever you want to call it. They said maybe this could be used as an unconventional educational tool. Psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, students could spend 6-8 hours in the world that's very much like the world of their patients, and then be able to understand them better, be able to communicate with them better, and hopefully be more successful in their treatment, which was really sorely needed in psychiatry. We were using electroshocks, insulin comas, the cardiazol shocks, and dunking people in cold water, very medieval kind of method. So there was a great excitement that if it is true that there's such similarity between the LSD experience and what we see in our patients, that mental diseases would not be mental diseases, they would be really chemical aberrations. And if we can find somehow the substance that is doing it, we can then neutralize it. We can find, so it would be like a test tube solution for schizophrenia. So it's like a holy grail of psychiatry. So I got excited. I was at that time quite disappointed by psychoanalysis, how long it takes, how much money, and how not so impressive the results are. And so I volunteered, and my preceptor was also interested in EEG, electroencephalography, and also the influence of stroboscopic light on the brain waves. So we all had to agree not only to have the EEG before, during, and after, but be exposed to a powerful stroboscope. This was called driving of the brain waves. See if you can induce somehow certain frequencies in the brain by the stroboscopic light. And this combination was so fantastic, and my consciousness was catapulted out of the body. I lost the research assistant, the clinic, Prague, the planet, and I had the feeling that the way I knew myself was just extinguished, and I had the feeling I just became, all of existence. And then on the way back, I was in the astronomical universe, and then when she turned it off, I found the planet, I found my body, and then took me a while to bring my consciousness together, to align my consciousness with my body. And then it became absolutely clear that what they taught me at the university, that consciousness is somehow produced by the brain, was just not true. And that consciousness is something cosmic, and that it's mediated by the brain, but not really generated in the brain.
Kasnije ste također radili istraživanja sa LSD-om i do kada?
Well, then, I joined first a group of people who were studying, who had access to different psychedelics, and we were comparing.
Koji su to bili psihodelici?
Well, we had LSD, of course. Then Dr. Hoffman isolated psilocybin and psilocin from the magic mushrooms of the Mazatec Indians. He also discovered in Morning Glory, another ergot derivative. We had mescaline, which actually was known in a pure form since the turn of the centuries, 19th to the 20th century. Then in Budapest, they were developing tryptamine derivatives, dimethyltryptamine, diethyltryptamine, dipropyltryptamine. So we had those. And then later we had the amphetamine derivatives that are psychedelic, or they're called entheogens, generated the divine within. And there are many of them, MDA, MMDA, MDMA, STP, 2CB. There's this kind of chemical genius, Sasha Shalgin, who was producing a whole series of these. There's the dissociative anesthetic used by the surgeons called ketalar, ketamine, that produces powerful cosmic experiences. If you take that as an anesthetic, you don't pass out, you go out. Your consciousness has these incredible experiences in the cosmos, so you don't care what they do with your body.
Kada je prestalo korištenje i eksperimentiranje sa svim tim tvarima koje ste nabrojali?
Well, it was 1973. I started at the Research Institute in Prague, where I was the main investigator. And then in the late 60s, I emigrated to the United States. I was teaching at Johns Hopkins University and then also working at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, where we had studies with neurotics, with alcoholics, with drug addicts. We did a lot of work with terminal cancer patients, trying to find out if mystical experiences induced by psychedelics would take away the fear of death and transform the experience of dying. And then when Walter Pankey, who was one of our team, disappeared during diving in the Pacific Ocean, then for several years I was heading this last surviving research. And then it was becoming more and more difficult to get money and the permission. I had just a lot of material, and I was offered to write a book. And a friend of mine, Michael Murphy, offered me to come to Esalen, which is a fantastic place, old Indian grounds on the Pacific Ocean with hot springs and so on. And so I wrote the first couple of books there, and then I got so attached to California that I decided not to go back to Baltimore. And then, there was less and less money, and the research really kind of tapered off. And it took 40 years. Now we are experiencing fantastic renaissance. There are at least 7 major universities that are returning to psychedelic research: Johns Hopkins, UCLA, the University of Arizona, State University of New York, Johns Hopkins. Several of them are repeating the studies with cancer patients that we did, but using psilocybin, which LSD is still so compromised by what the journalists did to it, and Woodstock, the mass use that there is a hesitation to return to LSD, but psilocybin has very similar effects.
Dakle, pojavila su se zakonska ograničenja, interes je zbog toga pomalo nestao, novca je nestalo, tvari su bile sve nedostupnije, sve nelegalnije. I tada ste krenuli jednim putem koji vas je doveo do toga da nikakve tvari zapravo nisu čovjeku ni potrebne da bi nešto radio sa svojom sviješću. To je ono što ste nazvali holotropic breathwork, odnosno holotropski rad disanjem. Kada i kako ste vi i vaša supruga dobili inspiraciju za to i čime ste inspirirali, kako ste nekako strukturirali tu metodu?
Well, we developed it at the Esalen Institute, which is like a human laboratory, you see. It used to be a motel, and then Michael Murphy inherited, and he didn't want to run a motel, so he created this human laboratory where people who had something new to offer, which was too far out for universities and research institutes, could come and experiment. So I lived 14 years in the Esalen Institute, and initially I was giving talks about what happened in these holotropic states, and people were not very happy. They said, well, it's great to hear about these experiences, but can't we do something? You have something little on the side. I said, sorry, I don't have the permission, the legal permission. We cannot use psychedelics. And then I remembered working with psychedelics, that as people were coming down and were not well resolved, they actually asked me for certain kinds of body work. And when I was doing it, they started breathing faster and said that it took them back into the session. And then Christina was a teacher of Hatha Yoga, and her father was a musician. So we started experimenting just with breath and music and the body work. And we found out that people had powerful experiences. And I realized that you don't have to have some kind of a strong exotic substance, that actually many people are very close. There are people who have spiritual emergencies when that material happens without taking anything. There are people who are so close to it that they have to fight it in everyday life. And just when they come to our session where they know that there is an environment where we support that we don't use tranquilizers, but we will work with them. When we do the holotropic breathwork, at the beginning there is a relaxation exercise, and some people are in the experience before they even start breathing faster. So in the population, these experiences are very, very close to the surface for many people.
Znači, uglavnom se radi o disanju, ritmu i glazbi. Nečem vrlo temeljnom za ljudski rod.
And then we use what we call Mandala Drawings, something that Jung was also doing. We give afterwards people a piece of paper with a circle and some pastels and some watercolors or whatever we have, and ask them to sit for a while and then communicate what happened to them in any way they can. Just colors and geometrical mandalas, figurative painting, and so on. And this is like when we do the sharing groups, people bring the mandalas, and sometimes the mandala tells you more than what people are talking about. So it's like a right hemisphere report about the experience, whereas talking about it is the left hemisphere, kind of a digital way of communicating about the experience.
Transpersonalna iskustva, čuli smo do sada i kroz razgovor sa vama i u prilogu, imaju dakle iscijeljiteljsku funkciju, mogu imati učiteljsku funkciju, ponekad su učenje i iscijeljivanje zapravo spojeni. Čim više znaš i razumiješ, time ćeš se moći bolje riješiti problema. Također ima i ulogu iskustva, jednog dubokog mističnog iskustva koje na razne načine produblje život. No, kartografiju psihe, kako ste to nazvali, se može osim na transpersonalna iskustva proširiti i na, kao što smo opet čuli u prilogu, ono što se zove perinatalnim iskustvima, odnosno iskustvima vezano uz rođenje, pa čak i prije rođenja. Koje su to empirijske istraživanja su dovela do prepoznavanja nekakve 4 osnovne matrice koje su vezane za razdoblje prije i za vrijeme poroda? Koje bi to bile, kako bi se uopće njih moglo opisati, razdijeliti i ko zna, možda ponešto korisno o njima saznati?
Well, I came into this work equipped with my medical training and also my knowledge of and experience of Freudian psychoanalysis. And I really started using LSD first and then other psychedelics to accelerate and deepen the process. But they have found out that people would not stay in the psyche as defined by Freud, which is everything is postnatal, everything is what happens after birth. Freud said the newborn is a tabula rasa, is a kind of clean slate, erased slate, tablet. And suddenly people started moving to experiences where they felt they're getting trapped and they have difficulties breathing, and they were talking about going crazy and never coming back. And then one after another they identified that actually they were in the birth canal, and then it opened up and they struggled, and there was an experience of going into light. And I started sort of studying these experiences, and they fell into 4 categories characterized by emotions, by physical feelings, by certain symbolism that was coming with it, and it was associated with the perinatal matrices, with the consecutive stages of birth. The first is still being in the womb, then it closes in, and the second one is when the contractions happen but the cervix is not open, and then the third matrix is when the cervix open, the struggle to be born, and the fourth matrix is actually coming out. And then it turned out that there's a reservoir of difficult emotions, difficult physical sensations that can become source of emotional and psychosomatic problems in interaction with something that happens postnatally that either creates a buffering zone and separates you from that, or actually keeps it open or produces connection with consciousness. So it's an extremely important dimension in the psyche. And then beyond it, of course, is the transpersonal experience of identification with other people, group consciousness, identification with animals, and then the Jungian collective unconscious, which is historical. You can visit different periods in history, sometimes with the feeling of remembering, then it's the realm of reincarnation. You can also experience any kind of mythology of cultures, even if you don't know anything about it intellectually. This was Jung's great discovery of the collective unconscious. Now, I thought initially that I was creating new maps for psychology because I had a tool, powerful tool. Like if telescope came, microscope came, it opened up sort of certain domains that were not available. And when I had the cartography together, I realized this was not a new cartography at all, actually a very old one that has been around in different cultures at different times, and is connected to what Huxley called perennial philosophy. I also realized that in the history of psychoanalysis, there were people who actually discovered this. You know, Otto Rank wrote a book on the birth trauma, and then Jung opened up this whole domain of the collective unconscious. So the cartography which I developed integrates these different elements, but they exist as, you know, it's not exactly in the same form that I described it, but in principle they exist in different schools.
Problem je, naravno, tih se trenutaka rođenja niti ne sjećamo. U konačnici nešto što nam se tada dogodi, neka što majka konzumira ili nešto, nekakva nezgodna situacija nas obilježe negdje, a ne znamo ni gdje ni što tražiti dok ne uspijemo izići iz svog svakodnevnog iskustva. Spomenuli ste da ste našli poveznice sa starim arhetipovima, obrazcima, simbolima koji su u ljudskoj vrsti prisutni u raznim tradicijama oduvijek. Zanimljiv je moment to da ste se u nekom trenutku također bez ikakvog poznavanja astrologije našli u području koje zapravo na neki simboličan način povezuje astrologija kroz svoje simbole, imena planeta i sl. Kakva je tu veza nastala? Odnosno, kako se odjednom ta astrologija koja je najklasičniji primjer neznanstvene ili predznanstvene discipline, često zovu pseudoznanstvene, našla odjednom unutar tih psiholoških istraživanja?
Yeah, well, that was, you know, a difficult one for me with my training, medical training and training in psychology. And the problem is that you have to radically change your whole worldview. You cannot add astrology to the Cartesian Newtonian worldview. I talked with Carl Sagan, who was a great astronomer, and said, astrology is complete nonsense. As I'm standing here, I have more influence on you than Pluto. He thought in terms of gravitational field and some influences. This is not the way you think in astrology. In astrology, the question is synchronicity, that you have to accept that the universe is created by superior intelligence. There's a master plan. There's an archetypal domain that influences what's happening here, and it's correlated with movements of planets and the angular relationships. So it's a quite drastic change. Now, the way it happened, I worked with a friend with Rick Tarnas. We were both at Esselen, and somebody came who was really aficionado of astrology and said, if you work with non-ordinary states, why don't you look at astrology? And we were open enough that we let him, you know, teach us how to do a chart. And then we looked at it, and the phenomenology of the four matrices, you're reading a handbook of astrology. The first, you know, in the womb is very Neptunian. It's about water, so that people have also cosmic experiences, cosmic union and so on. Then Saturn is the compression, depression, oppression, guilt and stuff like that. And the third, Pluto, is powerful energies, death, birth, sex, rebirth, and even elimination. There's an encounter with biological processes. And the fourth matrix is the opening into light. That's very, very Uranian. And so that itself was amazing. I didn't know anything about astrology, and I created astrological, you know, archetypal constellations. But then we found out that people actually have experiential encounter with these perinatal energies when they have the corresponding planets as transit. That means when the planets in the sky make a certain kind of a angle with where the planets were at the time when they were born. So when you have a Saturn, challenging Saturn transit, that's where you would have the experience in the second matrix. Or the opening comes with, let's say, Uranus and good sort of connection, good angle with Jupiter, you know, or some other your sun. So there are correlations. We have now studied it for 30 years, And Rick wrote a book where he was showing that in the history of humanity, there is a systematic correlation between, let's say, wars and challenging Saturn, Pluto, Mars. Like in 9/11, there was what's called T-square, Saturn, Mars, Pluto. And you find it in all revolutions, both world wars and so on. Major discoveries he found are correlated with Jupiter, Uranus. I mean, you can read the book, and it's amazing how one situation after another correlates. So, I'm open to evidence. That's just because it's a paradigm challenge. This is not new. It happened in the past. And what I didn't say, that the scientists usually make another error, which is they confuse their present paradigm, their present description of reality, for accurate description, where they actually have a map. This is confusion of map and territory. And Gregory Bateson, great system theorist, said that if scientists made that kind of error, they can one day come into the restaurant and eat the menu instead of the dinner.
U svakom slučaju, kao što je nekada davno ste krenuli prema transpersonalnim iskustvima koja su pokazala da svijest i mozak nisu povezani na onaj način kako se smatralo, bilo je na neki način logično da se put zatvori od svemira prema natrag i da, evo, kao što ste stazili u 5 zaključaka, da ispada da je kozmos prožet dušom, da postoje arhetipi, sinkroniciteti, da postoji psihološki značaj procesa rođenja, veze između holotropskih stanja i planetarnih tranzita. I naravno, kad bismo se vratili opet na početak našeg razgovora, ono što nismo spomenuli da je jedno od najvažnijih razloga između verbalne i iskustvene psihoterapije, to što u prvom slučaju treba dosta vremena, najčešće godine, dok ova iskustva dopuštaju da se stvari rasvijetle, shvate i da jednostavno nestanu. Vjerujem da bi mogli potrošiti još kojih 50 minuta na ove razgovore, ali nemamo u ovom našem svemiru uzročno-posljedičnom, nemamo više vremena. Hvala vam što ste nas posjetili. Ako dođete opet u Hrvatsku, dođite nam i opet.
Again, the ancient Romans said, vita brevis ars longa. I mean, we certainly need much more time. I would like to refer people again to my personal website, which is my whole name, stanislavgrof.com. There are actually papers on how we use astrology with examples and many other papers on the subject that we were talking about.
Tako je, zahvaljujem. www.stanislavgrof.com je stranica na kojoj možete vidjeti mnoge znanstvene radove koji potvrđuju današnju priču. Također www.holotropskodisanje.com je stranica na kojoj se možete nekako uključiti u holotropsko disanje na području Hrvatske. Snaći ćete se već sa internetom, vjerujem. U svakom slučaju, hvala Stanislavu Grofu, a izmijenjena stanja svijesti zapravo znače izmijenjeni prikaz svijeta i nas samih, a i svijeta oko nas, a s obzirom da takozvani vanjski svijet i nije drugo nego višedimenzionalni prikaz u nama, da su ono što je gore i ono što je dolje, ono što je vani, ono što je unutra na toliko čudnih načina povezani i to neuzročno posljedičnih, rekli bismo sinkronicitetnih, čini se da negdje u našoj svijesti ipak postoje vrata koje treba ponovno otvoriti. Kao neki novi početak, bez predrasuda ili nametnutih ograničenja raznih modela interpretacije svijeta. Do tada, ili možda već od sada, laku noć.